Kurs halten, Kompanie! Wir müssen diesen Hügel erreichen!
January 17th, 1944. A German armored column rumbles through the frost-bitten fields of northern France. Engines clatter, metal groans, and tracks churn the frozen earth beneath. Dust and smoke trail behind, curling into the pale winter sky. Officers peer over maps and through binoculars, confident that their path is clear, that no one is watching. Suddenly, the faint hum of engines above grows sharper. A shadow sweeps across the convoy. Soldiers glance upward, squinting at the approaching silhouettes. Bombers and fighter bombers streak through the clouds, diving with lethal precision. Explosions tear the ground apart, sending plumes of dirt and fire into the air. Tanks are engulfed in flames before they can react. Artillery pieces are shredded. The orderly rhythm of movement becomes chaos. Officers shout orders, their voices swallowed by the roar of aircraft. Panic spreads through the ranks. Men abandon vehicles, stumble through mud and snow, some frozen in fear. In moments, what was a disciplined, imposing column is reduced to a scene of confusion, smoke, and terror. Everywhere, the human cost is visible. The fear in the eyes of those who survive marks the moment when the battlefield itself seems to have turned against them. By early 1944, the tide of the Second World War had shifted decisively against Germany. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army pressed westward with relentless momentum. On the Western Front, the Allies were consolidating positions in preparation for the long-awaited invasion of occupied France. The Luftwaffe, once dominant over the skies of Europe, was stretched thin, facing relentless Allied bombing campaigns that targeted fuel depots, airfields, and supply lines. German ground forces, still formidable on paper, increasingly relied on motorized columns to move troops, artillery, and supplies quickly across contested territory. These columns were the arteries of German strategy, moving vital forces to threatened sectors, but they were also rigid, predictable, and vulnerable when faced with modern air power. The Allies, understanding these vulnerabilities, had perfected coordinated air-ground operations. Tactical air support was no longer a mere harassment tool. It had become a strategic weapon capable of decimating entire formations before they could engage the enemy. Reconnaissance planes scoured the countryside, identifying choke points and staging areas. Fighter bombers, armed with rockets and precision bombs, waited for the signal to strike. The combination of real-time intelligence, advanced ordnance, and air superiority meant that any exposed German column risked destruction in minutes. In northern France, the Germans were preparing for winter offensives to reinforce positions along key roadways and rail junctions. These motorized columns, often comprised of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and towed artillery, were meant to be fast and flexible. Officers drilled their men on speed, maneuvering, and defensive positioning. Yet the same rigidity that made these formations efficient also made them predictable. Roads were narrow, terrain often flat and open, leaving no cover from the sky. Every movement, every formation, was now under the unseen scrutiny of Allied reconnaissance and air control. Morale within the German ranks was a complex mixture of confidence and growing apprehension. Officers prided themselves on their tactical skill and the perceived invincibility of their armored units, while soldiers relied on strict discipline and training to survive. But reports were filtering through. Columns that had moved the previous week were shredded by attacks from above, entire brigades immobilized within minutes. The winter frost froze more than the ground. It seemed to freeze certainty itself, leaving officers increasingly uneasy about the reliability of their plans. The Allies' strategic doctrine emphasized the destruction of German mobility over territorial gain. Rather than engaging in frontal assaults, which were costly and uncertain, Allied commanders focused on disrupting supply lines, cutting communication, and annihilating the enemy's ability to maneuver. Air support became the linchpin of this approach. In carefully coordinated attacks, fighter bombers would target vehicles, artillery, and convoys, while bombers struck supply depots and rail hubs. Intelligence reports, sometimes intercepted from German channels, revealed the growing fear that a single well-placed airstrike could obliterate months of planning. For German officers, these warnings were both familiar and incomprehensible. They had trained their men to expect artillery barrages, ambushes, even infantry attacks, but the sky had become an unpredictable enemy. Air power was no longer limited to large-scale bombing raids on cities or industrial centers. It had become precise, tactical, and lethal. Every movement of a column, every concentration of vehicles on an open road became a potential death sentence. And yet, the German war machine pressed forward. Orders were given. Columns were dispatched. Reconnaissance reports were scrutinized, yet the human tendency to underestimate the enemy persisted. There was faith in speed, in formation discipline, in armored protection. And in that faith lay vulnerability. Because in the coming hours, the reality of modern warfare, the devastating efficiency of coordinated air support, would be revealed with terrifying clarity. The stage was set. Frozen fields, narrow roads, disciplined formations moving under overcast skies, oblivious to the predator waiting above. For the officers commanding these columns, confidence and fear sat uneasily side by side. Every decision carried weight. Every misstep could be fatal. And above all, one unrelenting truth dominated the battlefield. The war had changed, and the sky was no longer neutral. The roads of northern France, though vital for movement, offered little in the way of concealment. Fields stretched flat and unbroken for miles, interrupted only by the occasional hedgerow or farmstead. In winter, the snow and frost gleamed under the weak sunlight, turning open terrain into a stark canvas upon which the war would be painted. German officers were acutely aware of the logistical importance of these routes, yet they had limited options. Any deviation risked delays, breakdowns, or exposure to partisan attacks. The network of roads dictated movement, forcing columns into predictable patterns that Allied intelligence had meticulously charted. Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew high above, surveying these thoroughfares with precision cameras. Each convoy's length, composition, and spacing could be estimated from the air, providing planners with near-perfect situational awareness. From their command posts, Allied officers coordinated airstrikes with a level of timing that made interception almost impossible. Fighter bombers, loaded with rockets and high-explosive ordnance, could appear within minutes, striking from multiple angles simultaneously. Bombers followed in calculated patterns, targeting dense concentrations of vehicles. For a German column moving along a road, the sky had become a deadly trap, a lethal web from which escape was almost impossible. Within the German ranks, the officers attempted to adapt. Scouts were sent ahead, lookouts positioned at intervals, and radio checks were frequent. Yet the very measures meant to protect the formation also highlighted its vulnerabilities. Once the air attack began, the narrow roads offered few avenues for dispersal. Vehicles became easy targets, especially slower-moving trucks carrying supplies or towed artillery. Tanks, though heavily armored, were not invincible. Their thin-top armor offered little protection from bombs or rockets striking from above. The combination of confined movement, predictable routes, and relentless air observation created a scenario where disaster could unfold in moments. Compounding these vulnerabilities was the state of German air cover. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had been depleted by years of sustained combat on multiple fronts. Experienced pilots were scarce, and fuel shortages restricted the number of sorties that could be flown. The few remaining fighters were often tasked with protecting cities, airfields, or industrial centers. The German columns moving across open fields had little hope of interception from their own air forces. Against the well-coordinated Allied attacks, any reliance on Luftwaffe support was fragile at best and dangerously misleading at worst. Even within the command posts, tension was palpable. Reports from prior weeks indicated that entire battalions could be rendered ineffective by a single airstrike. Officers debated speed versus formation density, trying to balance the need for rapid movement with the necessity of maintaining cohesion. Decisions were made quickly, sometimes arbitrarily, with little more than instinct and training to guide them. The mental strain on commanders was immense. Each mile covered carried not only the risk of tactical failure, but also the possibility of mass casualties among their men. Allied planning had anticipated these human and tactical factors. Airstrikes were synchronized to hit at moments when columns were most vulnerable, during river crossings, at intersections, or while halting for refueling or maintenance. Intelligence emphasized the psychological impact as well. Destruction from above would not only immobilize vehicles, but also erode morale, creating panic and disarray that could ripple through the ranks. The combination of meticulous preparation, overwhelming firepower, and precise timing made the eventual outcome almost inevitable once the operation began. And yet, the German officers continued their march. They relied on doctrine, on experience, on the discipline instilled in their troops. Confidence mingled with apprehension, a fragile veneer that masked the true danger above. Each wheel turning, each engine revving, brought them closer to the moment when theory would meet reality, when air power would reveal the full scale of its lethality. The columns were moving, but the battlefield itself was already set against them. Above, the clouds thickened. The hum of distant engines could be faintly heard, almost imperceptible against the wind. The soldiers pressed forward, unaware that in the next hours, every decision, every formation, and every maneuver would be tested in the crucible of modern warfare. The sky was no longer neutral. It was a weapon, precise, unyielding, and ready to strike. For the men in the German columns, the war had always been a test of discipline, endurance, and courage. Yet nothing could fully prepare them for the terror from above. Soldiers had trained for artillery barges, infantry assaults, and ambushes, but the sudden appearance of aircraft swooping from the sky introduced a chaos that no drill could contain. The roar of engines was deafening, the whistling of bombs unnerving. Men scrambled from vehicles, some slipping in mud and snow, others frozen in shock as fire and smoke consumed the machines they had depended upon. Officers barked orders, attempting to restore some semblance of control, but the natural human instinct for self-preservation often overwhelmed discipline. Soldiers huddled behind the scant cover of hedgerows or abandoned vehicles, only to be strafed or hit by falling ordnance. The human cost was immediate and visceral. Screams, shouts, and the metallic clang of armor being torn apart became the soundtrack of survival. Each moment stretched into an eternity, every decision potentially life or death. Fear spread faster than fire. Panic was contagious. Yet, amid the terror, small acts of courage persisted. Tank crews fired at diving aircraft with whatever weapons they had. Drivers accelerated through the chaos, trying to maneuver out of kill zones. Medics ran between vehicles, dragging the wounded to relative safety. These moments, fleeting but intense, highlighted the resilience of soldiers even when the battlefield itself seemed to turn against them. From a tactical standpoint, the vulnerability of the columns was glaring. German motorized formations were designed for rapid movement and concentrated force. Yet the very qualities that made them effective also made them fragile under air attack. Long lines of tanks, trucks, and artillery moving along narrow roads offered clear, stationary targets to pilots above. Columns were often spaced in intervals to maintain cohesion and reduce the risk of a single explosion destroying multiple vehicles. But even these precautions were insufficient against coordinated airstrikes. Tactical doctrine dictated that anti-aircraft units should accompany the columns, yet these were often limited in number and caliber. Light flak guns could deter strafing runs, but were largely ineffective against bombs or rockets aimed at armor. The sheer speed of the attack, combined with multiple entry vectors from the sky, meant that any tactical response from the ground units was delayed and largely reactive. Officers attempted to adjust formations, change routes, or disperse vehicles, but the timing of the air strikes and the predictability of road networks minimized the effectiveness of these maneuvers. Air superiority transformed the tactical battlefield. German commanders had to consider not only the enemy on the ground, but also the unseen predator above. Every decision, whether to halt, advance, or regroup, was made under the shadow of aircraft capable of annihilating columns in minutes. This constant threat forced improvisation, often with mixed results, and exposed the limits of even the most disciplined military formations in modern combined arms warfare. The weapons from above were as sophisticated as they were lethal. Allied fighter bombers and light bombers were equipped with rockets, high-explosive bombs, and cannons designed to penetrate armor and demolish vehicles. Bombs dropped from precision altitudes shattered tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, sending shrapnel and fire across the formation. Rockets, launched in rapid salvos, carved lethal paths through columns, striking multiple vehicles simultaneously. Even aircraft-mounted machine guns contributed to the chaos, mowing down infantry who sought cover on the periphery. On the German side, the columns relied on armor and anti-aircraft weapons that were increasingly inadequate. Tank armor could resist frontal assaults from small-caliber rounds, but the fin-top armor left them vulnerable to bombs and rockets. Half-tracks and trucks were largely defenseless. Even heavy flak guns struggled against the speed and maneuverability of modern fighter bombers. Communication equipment, meant to coordinate anti-aircraft responses, was often disrupted by explosions or jamming, further reducing the ability to mount effective defense. Technology, in this context, dictated survival. The Allies had combined intelligence, aircraft performance, and ordnance precision into a system of overwhelming lethality. German columns, no matter how disciplined or numerous, were ill-equipped to respond effectively. In this deadly calculus, machinery and weaponry determined not only the outcome of engagements, but also the psychological state of the men inside them, creating a feedback loop of fear, confusion, and destruction. For German officers, the situation presented a paradox. They were trained to command, to maintain order, and to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. Yet, air attacks stripped away much of that authority in a matter of moments. Orders became almost meaningless when vehicles erupted in flames, men scattered in panic, and communications were severed by explosions. Commanders had to make instantaneous decisions, whether to halt, regroup, or continue forward, while knowing that any choice could increase casualties. The officers' leadership was tested not just by the physical destruction, but by the psychological unraveling of their men. Some sought to restore discipline through vocal authority, moving along the roads to rally fleeing soldiers. Others attempted to reorganize the column under fire, repositioning remaining vehicles to cover gaps or protect artillery. Even experienced commanders found themselves reacting to events rather than directing them. The battlefield had become a dynamic, chaotic entity, one that no map or plan could fully account for. The fear etched into the faces of their troops weighed heavily on officers, forcing rapid adjustments that were often too little, too late. From the Allied side, the destruction of German columns was the product of careful strategy and coordination. Intelligence officers had studied road networks, terrain, and prior enemy movements, identifying predictable patterns that could be exploited. Pilots trained rigorously in dive bombing, strafing, and rocket attacks knew exactly how to approach, strike, and withdraw while minimizing risk. Missions were meticulously timed, with reconnaissance planes confirming the presence of targets moments before the strike. Air commanders understood the tactical advantage of surprise and timing. Columns moving along narrow roads became perfect targets for overlapping waves of aircraft. Fighter bombers would approach in coordinated formations, maximizing damage by attacking simultaneously from multiple angles. The precision of these attacks, combined with superior numbers, ensured that German forces could not recover quickly. Every destroyed vehicle and immobilized tank contributed not only to the immediate battlefield objective, but also to the larger strategic goal, reducing the enemy's capacity to maneuver and reinforcing the psychological dominance of Allied air power. The psychological impact of air attacks on the German soldiers and officers cannot be overstated. The sudden, overwhelming nature of the assault created fear that spread faster than the explosions themselves. Panic undermined discipline. Confusion turned training into hesitation, hesitation into vulnerability. Men who had faced infantry assaults, artillery barges, and close combat found themselves paralyzed by the invisible threat from above. For officers, the terror was compounded by responsibility. Every order carried life or death consequences. Witnessing entire sections of their column obliterated forced a reckoning. Leadership was not only about strategy, but about survival under circumstances that exceeded any prior experience. Morale, once sustained by confidence in technology, training, and experience, became fragile. The psychological shock of aerial devastation lingered long after the battle, influencing subsequent engagements and shaping the perception of Allied air power as an almost omnipresent force. Even for those who survived, the mental toll was profound. Soldiers recounted seeing comrades incinerated before their eyes, hearing the roar of engines and explosions, and feeling the helplessness of being trapped in open terrain. The combination of fear, chaos, and witnessing destruction firsthand imprinted memories that would last a lifetime, reinforcing the reality that modern warfare was not solely about tactics or numbers. It was about the capacity to endure the psychological pressures of a mechanized aerial battlefield. February 15th, 1944. Just past dawn, the German column had reached the crest of an open plain. The morning fog lingered in patches, clinging to the ground like smoke, offering fleeting concealment. Officers adjusted binoculars, scanning the horizon for potential threats. They noted nothing unusual, no enemy movements, no sign of reconnaissance planes. Confidence lingered, though subtly eroded by weeks of cautionary reports. At 7:42, the first sign appeared. A distant hum, almost imperceptible, rose above the engines of trucks and tanks. Men glanced upward, squinting through the weak sunlight. Moments later, shadows swept across the column. Fighter bombers broke through the clouds, diving at angles calculated for maximum effect. The attack began. Explosions erupted in rapid succession. The lead trucks, laden with ammunition, were the first to ignite. Fire consumed vehicles in seconds, sending thick black smoke into the sky. Tanks attempted evasive maneuvers, their engines straining as rockets tore through their thin top armor. Artillery pieces were shredded or overturned. The column, once a disciplined formation, fragmented under the onslaught. Officers shouted orders, their voices drowned out by the roar of aircraft and the crack of falling ordnance. Radio communications failed as lines were destroyed, isolating segments of the formation. Soldiers abandoned vehicles, running blindly for cover in open fields, only to be strafed or caught in secondary explosions. The snow-streaked terrain, which had once promised stability for movement, became a death trap. Tracks and footprints led directly into kill zones marked by smoke and fire. By 7:53, Less than 15 minutes into the attack, entire sections of the column had been immobilized. Tanks burned where they stood, trucks exploded in showers of metal, and artillery crews were trapped by the very guns they had been trained to operate. The precision of the Allied assault was undeniable. Pilots had targeted the densest concentrations first, ensuring maximum disruption. The Germans were caught in a deadly rhythm. Move, explode, scatter, and repeat. Amid the chaos, small pockets of resistance emerged. A platoon of soldiers attempted to regroup behind a hedgerow, firing whatever weapons they could muster at descending aircraft. A tank commander tried to maneuver out of the line of attack, but rockets struck with terrifying accuracy, halting progress in a cloud of smoke and flame. Medics ran between burning vehicles, dragging the wounded toward fleeting safety, only to be forced back by the relentless strafing. The human toll was immediate and graphic. Shouts of pain and panic filled the air. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the metallic tang of shredded armor. Soldiers watched comrades consumed by fire or blown apart by explosions, their fear intensifying with every passing second. Even experienced officers, trained in the calculus of war, could do little beyond issuing orders and hoping their men survived long enough to respond. By 8:10, the column was in full disarray. Vehicles were abandoned mid-road, engines still running, smoke curling into the sky. Tanks and trucks formed chaotic barriers, blocking any potential retreat or reorganization. The once pristine formation had become a fragmented battlefield, a mixture of fire, mud, and frozen earth. Pilots circled overhead, adjusting targets with lethal precision, ensuring that no section could recover. This initial phase of destruction revealed the full power of coordinated air support. The Allies had combined intelligence, timing, and technology to create a near-perfect strike. German officers, despite their best efforts, were overwhelmed. Every minute brought new losses, each more harrowing than the last. The battlefield had shifted. The sky had seized control, dictating the terms of survival and destruction alike. By 8:20, the German column had lost its cohesion entirely. The carefully drilled formations, meant to maximize mobility and firepower, were now a fragmented collection of burning vehicles, abandoned guns, and scattered soldiers. Officers ran along the narrow road, attempting to issue orders, but their voices were swallowed by explosions and the roar of engines overhead. Even the most experienced commanders struggled to assess the situation, their maps and radios rendered useless amid the chaos. The attack intensified. Waves of fighter bombers returned, strafing the roads, firing rockets, and dropping high-explosive bombs on concentrated clusters. Tanks that had survived the initial salvo were engulfed in flames. Ammunition trucks detonated in violent eruptions, sending shrapnel across the frozen fields. Soldiers sought cover wherever they could, but the terrain offered little protection. Mud, snow, and debris slowed movement, turning the retreat into a desperate scramble. Officers' faces, pale and tight with tension, betrayed a mixture of disbelief and terror. Every decision, whether to regroup, advance, or abandon vehicles, was fraught with risk. Some attempted to organize defensive positions along hedgerows or sunken roads, but the concentrated fire from the sky made these efforts futile. Communications broke down entirely as radios were destroyed or lost, leaving units isolated. Command had become impossible. The battlefield had taken over. By 8:35, it was clear that the column, once a symbol of German operational strength, was effectively destroyed. Dozens of vehicles lay in ruins, twisted metal blackened by fire. Tanks were overturned or burned beyond recognition. Artillery pieces were shattered or stranded in the snow. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage, dazed, bleeding, and stunned by the rapidity of their losses. The human toll was staggering. Officers and enlisted men alike had witnessed comrades incinerated, blown apart, or crushed under collapsing machinery. The psychological collapse mirrored the physical destruction. Panic had spread beyond the front line. Soldiers who had previously demonstrated discipline and cohesion were now paralyzed by fear. Even small units that attempted to maintain order were undermined by the overwhelming noise, smoke, and violence. The attack from the sky had not only destroyed equipment and personnel, it had shattered confidence, eroded morale, and imposed a sense of helplessness that would linger long after the engagement. Allied pilots maintained their pressure. They swooped in low, targeting any remaining concentrations of vehicles or troops. Rockets tore through abandoned trucks. Machine gun fire strafed open fields where fleeing soldiers sought temporary refuge. The strike was surgical, precise, and relentless. The combination of preparation, timing, and technological superiority ensured that no element of the column could regroup effectively. By 9 o'clock, the aftermath of the attack was evident across the landscape. The road, once alive with movement and the hum of engines, was now a graveyard of charred metal and shattered timber. Smoke rose in columns, mixing with the winter mist, marking the path of destruction. Officers who survived gathered the remnants of their forces, their faces etched with fatigue, fear, and disbelief. Communication with higher command was intermittent at best. The flow of orders, reinforcements, and coordination had been severed. This decisive moment demonstrated a transformation in modern warfare. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by ground maneuver or infantry engagement. Air power had assumed the role of both hunter and executioner, capable of overwhelming even the most disciplined and well-equipped formations in minutes. German officers, trained to exert control over men and machines, had been rendered powerless by the sky. The columns, intended as instruments of operational mobility and strategic influence, had been reduced to ruins, their destruction a testament to the evolving nature of combat. By the time the smoke began to clear, the scale of devastation was fully apparent. The surviving soldiers, wounded, exhausted, and shaken, would carry the memory of this day for the rest of the war. Officers, confronted with the futility of their efforts in the face of overwhelming air superiority, will be forced to rethink strategy, formation, and tactics in the weeks to come. The battlefield itself had been transformed. The decisive power of coordinated air attacks had been proven beyond question. By mid-morning, the devastation was fully visible. The road, once a corridor of movement and coordination, had become a shattered tableau of fire, metal, and human suffering. German officers who survived the initial onslaught struggled to regroup what remained of their forces. Estimates quickly surfaced. Nearly half of the vehicles in the column had been destroyed or rendered inoperable, including dozens of tanks, trucks, and towed artillery. Ammunition and fuel stores were obliterated in the explosions, leaving the survivors with almost nothing to sustain mobility or combat readiness. Casualty reports, as grim as they were immediate, began to filter through. Hundreds of soldiers were killed outright in the initial air strikes, while others succumbed to burns, injuries from debris, or freezing exposure in the snow-strewn fields. Some men were trapped inside overturned vehicles, their cries drowned by the roar of engines and aircraft overhead. Command personnel were particularly hard hit. Senior officers were either killed, wounded, or missing, leaving subordinates to make desperate, improvised decisions to salvage remaining units. Operational assessments emphasized the scale of the failure. Commanders noted that the timing of the attack had maximized casualties and equipment losses. The column had been exposed on open terrain, predictable in movement, and inadequately supported by anti-aircraft elements. The Luftwaffe, largely absent due to fuel shortages and prior commitments, could offer little to counter the attack. From the German perspective, what had been intended as a disciplined maneuver had collapsed entirely under the precision of Allied air power. Even surviving sections of the column were severely compromised. Engines were damaged or destroyed, vehicles immobilized, and supply lines severed. Small units, isolated by terrain and fire, attempted to retreat toward nearby villages or forests, but the narrow roads and lingering threat of further airstrikes limited their options. The mobility that had been the column's strategic advantage was gone. Every movement now carried the risk of additional losses. Allied after-action reports, in contrast, emphasized efficiency and precision. Pilots and commanders noted that the operation had successfully destroyed a significant portion of the German operational capability in the area, with minimal losses to Allied forces. Intelligence officers highlighted the importance of coordinated reconnaissance and timing, stressing that predictable movement patterns and concentrated formations had contributed to the high success rate. From the air, the destruction was systematic, methodical, and absolute. The psychological impact on the survivors was immediate and profound. Soldiers reported feelings of disorientation, terror, and disbelief. Officers struggled to reassert control, often finding their men immobilized by fear rather than injury. The sudden and overwhelming nature of the attack left little room for rational assessment. Survival instinct had replaced training and procedure. Even those who managed to retreat carried the weight of witnessing entire units destroyed in minutes, a vivid reminder of the lethal power of coordinated airstrikes. By late morning, the battlefield had become a somber landscape of smoking wreckage and scattered survivors. The once formidable German column, meant to project power and maintain strategic initiative, had been neutralized in a matter of minutes. The immediate consequences, lost vehicles, shattered morale, and hundreds of casualties, would ripple through subsequent operations, forcing officers to reconsider formations, movement strategies, and the limits of traditional armored tactics in the face of modern air power. In the days that followed the attack, the full implications became increasingly apparent to German command. The destruction of the column had not only eliminated a substantial number of vehicles and men, but also disrupted broader operational plans. Reinforcements intended to reach forward positions were delayed or rerouted, and artillery support for nearby sectors was reduced. The psychological blow was equally severe. Confidence in traditional armored mobility had been shaken, and officers began to reconsider reliance on linear, predictable formations. Morale across the affected units plummeted. Soldiers who had survived recounted the chaos, the suddenness of the attack, and the seemingly omnipresent threat from the sky. Fear became a pervasive factor, influencing subsequent engagements and causing hesitation in maneuvers that would have previously been executed with discipline and speed. Even those who had not been directly engaged internalized the lesson. Air superiority had become a decisive element in modern warfare, capable of rendering ground superiority almost irrelevant. Strategically, German commanders were forced to adapt. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched, could not be relied upon to provide sufficient cover for motorized columns, particularly in open terrain. Alternative tactics, including nighttime movement, dispersal of vehicles, and use of forested or uneven terrain, were increasingly considered to mitigate the effectiveness of Allied airstrikes. However, such measures often slowed movement, disrupted supply chains, and required meticulous coordination that was difficult to achieve under operational pressure. The Allies, meanwhile, recognized the broader impact of their success. The operation reinforced the effectiveness of coordinated air-ground strategy, demonstrating that air attacks could decisively shape ground operations without large-scale infantry engagement. Reports highlighted the advantage of integrated reconnaissance, precision targeting, and timing, which allowed smaller numbers of aircraft to inflict disproportionate damage. The attack became a case study in leveraging technological superiority and tactical foresight to achieve strategic objectives. Long-term, the event influenced subsequent German operational planning. Commanders were forced to acknowledge the vulnerability of armored and motorized formations to air attack, a lesson that would resonate across multiple theaters of war. Training programs were adjusted, reconnaissance and anti-aircraft tactics were emphasized, and caution became a dominant factor in movement planning. Yet even with adaptations, the psychological scars remained. Officers and men who survived the attack carried the memory of sudden, overwhelming destruction, a reminder that battlefield control could be seized not by numbers or discipline alone, but by precision, coordination, and the dominance of the skies. The destruction of the column also reshaped strategic calculations at higher levels. Supply routes had to be reconsidered, timing of troop movements adjusted, and confidence in mobility severely tempered. Every decision, from deployment to engagement, now included the looming factor of Allied air superiority. The event demonstrated a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. Traditional operational power could be neutralized in moments, and the capacity to dominate the skies had become as critical as ground strength. By the end of the week, the landscape of northern France bore the scars of both physical and psychological devastation. The attack had not only destroyed men and machines, it had shifted the perception of what constituted vulnerability and power on the modern battlefield. Commanders across the German army recognized that future operations would be forever constrained by the knowledge that the sky could strike anywhere, anytime, and with lethal precision. The destruction of the German column serves as a stark reminder of how warfare had evolved by 1944. What had once been the domain of tanks, infantry, and artillery was now profoundly influenced by the sky. Air power had become more than a supporting arm. It was a decisive force capable of shaping entire battles in minutes. The battlefield was no longer solely a matter of ground strength or tactical acumen. It was a contest for control over the air, and in this arena, speed, precision, and coordination could render even the most disciplined formations vulnerable. For the soldiers and officers who survived, the memory of that morning was indelible. The roar of engines, the flash of explosions, the acrid smoke rising from burning vehicles, all became symbols of both vulnerability and the unrelenting nature of modern warfare. Leadership was tested not only by strategy, but by the capacity to respond under conditions that defied control. Courage was no longer measured solely by engagement with the enemy on the ground, but by the ability to endure the chaos imposed from above. Strategically, the attack reinforced a profound truth. Mobility and manpower alone were insufficient in the face of technological and tactical superiority. Allied forces had demonstrated that careful planning, intelligence, and integration of air and ground operations could achieve results far beyond mere numbers. For German commanders, the lesson was sobering. Predictability, concentration, and over-reliance on armor could be catastrophic under modern air power. Yet beyond tactics and technology lies the human dimension. The terror, the fear, and the resilience witnessed that day reveal the enduring human element of war. Soldiers confronted forces beyond their control, officers faced impossible decisions, and every life carried the weight of those choices. The battlefield, though mechanized and precise, remained deeply human, defined as much by emotion and endurance as by strategy and ordnance. In the end, the morning that reduced an entire column to ruin marked more than a military victory. It symbolized the transformation of warfare itself. The skies had claimed dominance, and with them, the rules of engagement had irrevocably changed. History would remember not only the destruction, but the lesson it imparted. That in modern war, control of the air is as decisive as command of the ground, and that the cost of misjudgment is measured in lives, machines, and the fragile certainty of those who lead.